We are excited to have him back on again this season and look ahead to 4 awesome games for the college football world. And I want to remind you, Joel Klatt tonight will be on Fox, a Yuletide showdown in the DirecTV Holiday Bowl as the nation's leading passer, Kyle McCord, and the number 21 Syracuse football team take on Washington State. Klatt on the call tonight with Gus Johnson, of course, and Jenny Tapp from San Diego. Again, that's 7:30 Eastern on Fox. What's up, man? It's good to see you.
It's great to see you. I hope you had a great Christmas and holiday.
Yeah, I did. A little travel and ready to get back in time for the games because that's
love it.
Yeah, luckily only football and the NBA were on Christmas. All right, so let's look at these 4. There's a million things that I want to get to here, as you know, but
sure.
I want to make sure I give enough time to the actual games first and foremost. Of the 4 matchups, I probably already know your answer, but give me the one you're struggling the most with of trying to figure out like which way you would go picking the game.
Yeah, or Oregon, Ohio State. I mean, that's I know that's the boring answer, and that's the one you're going to get from most people. But man, that game just looks so good. I think in a lot of respects, with the way that Ohio State looked against Tennessee, I think that there's, at least in a lot of our minds, a good chance that these are the 2 best teams in the sport. You know, that these are the 2 best teams in college football. They played a 1-point game in Eugene. If Ohio State uses a game plan that plays in space and throws the ball, you would think that, you know, they can play with and maybe beat anybody. And yet Oregon's had the best season of anybody in college football. I can't wait for that. I'm actually going to take my boys and I'll be at the Rose Bowl.
Yeah, that's the answer. And I mean, any of us that have watched the entire season play out like you have, and watching what Ohio State did to Tennessee, where it was a Tennessee team that I don't know what they were trying to do in the backside in their coverage. I can still see their sophomore corner just like on every Smith route turning back around to everybody being like, are you guys serious? Like this is the plan.
Can we just stop for a moment?
McCoy,
like,
I believe.
If you're building a game plan, against Ohio State, you dare them to run the football. Just like put 4 guys in the box and just dare them to run the football. That's essentially what Michigan did, and Ohio State took the bait. And the fact that they were playing Jeremiah Smith with single coverage was wild. I couldn't believe it. And as soon as I saw the defense, I thought to myself, well, this margin is going to be however big Ohio State wants it to be. And it's exactly how it played out.
Yeah, I mean, that was ugly, and I try not to go too much into the body language because I don't think anybody down 3 scores that quickly all of a sudden is going to look like they're having a blast on the sideline. But Tennessee looked cold. The only thing that worked was Nico scrambles, which means all the other things. You couldn't run it, you couldn't throw it, you couldn't defend it, and it was a mess. And it was so dominant that I'm like, wait, and this happens to us all the time. And the recency of it is, you know, I picked Oregon this summer to win the whole thing. I thought they would split with Ohio State, lose the first one, win the second one, whether it was in the Big Ten championship game. Obviously, you know, could have played out. They play again. It's hard to go with Oregon because of what Ohio State looked like. But, you know, I don't want to just dismiss everything that we saw from the Ducks this year. Although I think, Joe, there's like a little lingering thing with that Penn State matchup where that defensive line for Oregon that I like got pushed around for an entire night by Penn State. But the problem is Penn State just couldn't defend what they were doing once the Ducks got the ball.
I think what's fascinating for us, and you know, you and I have watched this sport for a long time. And here's the hard part this season for me is that there isn't a great team. And normally in college football, at least in recent vintage, since like Saban got to Alabama, and maybe even before that, you know, even back to like USC, like there's always a team that you're like, I know they're great. They have no weaknesses, you know, like they do everything well. And this year it's not the case. And that's not to throw any cold water on what Oregon did this year, but you are right. I don't think that they're a dominant defensive line, you know, like we've seen from Michigan and Georgia and some of these other teams over the last couple of years. So, like, do you think that they can just go through and run this gauntlet unscathed? I think it'll be very difficult. I think that there's more parity at the top of college football this year than I've seen in quite some time. And because of that, you know, every team has their flaws. We've seen the flaws with Ohio State. We haven't necessarily seen it with Oregon, although they had the favorable Big Ten schedule, so it didn't pop up. I will say I I don't see either of these teams running away and hiding. The speed on the field, the talent on the field is going to be premium, and I think it's going to be a close game. The one thing that I will say though is like in these games when you get teams like this, generally speaking, you got to have a quarterback that outplays the other quarterback. That's what happened in the first matchup with Dylan Gabriel. And Dylan Gabriel is a guy for playing as well as he has this year for the best team in America. Boy, we don't talk about him a lot, do we? And I don't know why, and maybe that's an indictment on us, but I don't think we talk about him enough. And when you look at what he did against that pass rush from Penn State, getting himself just those little, reminded me of Michael Penix a lot against Texas last year, just moving ever so slightly and manipulating the pocket ever so slightly to get himself in a position to throw the ball down the field. That's dangerous against Ohio State because they rely on that pass rush getting there. And here's what we do know is that Oregon has the speed to outclass Ohio State's corners. So that's a matchup that if you're the Ducks, you really want to lean into.
Okay, so coming off the Penn State part of it, because the audience already knows this, so I'm just sharing it with you quickly. This is probably the best I've felt about Penn State,
Yeah,
and it had
same.
more to do with how they played against Oregon than certainly the SMU game. Because,
Yes.
who do you think is a tougher opponent, SMU or Boise State?
I mean, people think I'm a Genty hater anyways, but I think SMU is the more difficult opponent. I mean, rather than get into all of that, because everyone is, why do you hate the group of five? I don't hate the group of five. It's just like Boise's they're not as good as SMU. SMU was more balanced. They're more explosive. I mean, SMU drives down the field on the first series. If they complete that fourth down ball, it might be a different game. Jennings has an off day. Boise is very one-dimensional. That's just it is what it is. They don't have the speed to match up. So I feel great about Penn State. I am with you, man. And here's the deal. So I think of bigger arcs rather than just this season. Think of it, just pair yourself back a couple of years. If you go back a couple of years, James Franklin and Jim Harbaugh, really, they had to point at Ohio State and say, like, well, how are we going to beat Ohio State? James Franklin wanted to go in and he said, let's do it with speed and athleticism, try to match what they're doing on the outside. So, let's play man coverage, let's get length, let's get pass rush, let's do it that way and recruit heavy. And Jim Harbaugh went the opposite direction. He said, no, let's go in there and get big and rugged in the offensive and defensive lines, and let's beat them at the line of scrimmage and see who wins. Well, it worked out for Michigan. It did not work out for Penn State. Here's what's happened over the last couple of years is that you've seen a Penn State team not lose to teams that they shouldn't lose to. They just don't. I mean, you can say what you want about what they do in big games, and yes, they have fallen short against Michigan and Ohio State, namely in their conference, but they beat the teams that they should beat, and they generally do it handily. So I don't fear for them in this matchup against Boise. And then this year, in those games that we look at as the bigger matchups for James Franklin, think of it this way. A couple of years ago, Michigan ran him out of the building. Ohio State ran him out of the building. This year, it was a lot different against Ohio State and Oregon. They have a fourth down on the goal line to tie the game against Ohio State. They're right in the game in the Big Ten championship game. I think Penn State is as close as they have been since Kerry Collins to being like a legitimate national championship contender. I could see them coming out of that side of the bracket. I very much could see that. And the way they played against Oregon, and you're exactly right about that. The way they played against Oregon in a loss is what makes me actually believe in them more than what they did against SMU at home in the first round.
Yeah, that's really where I was because I have not liked it for a long time. I felt like, especially before the Big Ten expansion, it's like, okay, we'll dig into the schedule. And Penn State has this nice record. And, I'll admit on the broadcast, I've done a few eye rolls when you guys were like, hey, look at, it wasn't you, it was the graphics department.
No,
Penn State would have made six of the previous 12 playoffs. And I'm like, cool. Maybe that says more about the 12 team thing than it does. But yes, I mean, Aller, that fourth down throw against Oregon. And, people that were making fun of him for saying, I'm coming back, like, oh, cool. So now people don't have to worry about a fourth rounder. It's like, man, I think you're being way too dismissive about his progress. It's not about the stats of the guy that we saw last year and this year. It's just the dude. Like, I see a different guy. And, maybe it's not a first round grade in the 26th draft, but I'm with you. Like, I just don't know how you could watch Penn State all of these years and then watch them this year. And I know the Ohio State game is super frustrating and playing out the same way over and over again. I don't know how you'd watch that team this year and not feel a little bit better about them. So we'll
and
see.
especially in that side of the bracket, I mean, like, they can beat Notre Dame, they can beat Georgia. There's no doubt. So, I mean, they could easily find themselves out of it. And I would be remiss if I didn't just mention their offensive coordinator. Andy Kotelnicki has infused this confidence that rises when the best players have the football in their hands at the right times. And that was the way that James Franklin hired him. And he said, it's not just a request, that's a mandate. He didn't do that against Ohio State in that loss. And I remember going in and talking to him afterwards, and he was like, I can't believe I did. I can't believe Tyler Warren didn't touch the ball inside the 5. And it was like a total brain fart. And that lesson is going to pay off in a huge way for him moving forward.
So we've talked about that side of the bracket, so we could get to some of the seeding thing, but I just want to make sure we do something with Arizona State here, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because we know they're without Tyson, their leading receiver with a collarbone thing, and going into the Big 12 part of it, I didn't feel as bad about it as certainly I do now. And they're also going to be without Simmons, their top cover corner for the first half with a suspension carryover. So, Texas's defense is the thing that I've been able to bank on. Like, I can just list all the talent just like you can. I think the Ewers thing is kind of strange. And then against Clemson, which, I think there's a good version of the Clemson story for this year. Like, that was actually a pretty good football team. I'm not saying they're great, not saying that they're tier 1, but from some of the non-conference stuff that happened to them, I think it was easy to kind of overlook, like, that's still a good team, and Klubnik and having some receiver weapons that developed over the course of the year. So they hung in there with Texas, because even if you expect Texas to have the game that's frustrating, it's going to be the red zone nonsense in the, the touchdown percentage, which is abysmal, which just doesn't make any sense with the talent, the O-line, and a smart quarterback, but it just hasn't worked out. But for Clemson to not look like they were shut down at all, look, I can't pick Arizona State in this one, but Arizona State has been so much fun. The Texas defense, which is the one thing I thought I could bank on with them, was alarming against Clemson.
The issue, though, is I don't feel like you can just run the football on Texas. That's so, and I know their pass defense was a lot better this year, but Klubnik in that passing game got a little bit loose. And I think you got to give a lot of credit, and you were alluding to this, to Klubnik. Like, he played the best of any road quarterback by a wide margin in the first round, which is what you have to do. If we look at the NFL playoffs, what do we always talk about? Quarterback play. Why? Because it's difficult to go into a road environment and play well as a team if your quarterback isn't playing great. And Klubnik went in there and played great and gave his team a chance. They were one possession late in that game. Now, they ultimately obviously came up short. I believe Texas's defense is the most underrated defense in the country. I know that sounds crazy, but we talk about Georgia a lot. We talk about Ohio State and their defense a lot, and rightly so. But this defense for Texas, I think it takes a remarkable effort to get after them, which is what Klubnik had. No one's really done that this year. And so then I look at Arizona State and I'm like, do they have the pieces to threaten this Texas defense? No, they don't, because you need multiple pieces. You need more than Scadaboo. As much as I love this guy, I mean, I love watching this guy play. And who knows, maybe he's going to prove us all wrong and put the team on his back. But if you're looking at a player that you can focus on and try to take away, I think Texas will have a really good plan for him, a really good plan. One thing I would say, and it because it's not specific to this game, we've covered this sport long enough to know you rarely get back-to-back great performances from any team in college football. It's very rare. So what we're asking teams to do in this playoff is something that we've never asked college football teams to do. We ask college football teams to get up for huge moments and play their best in these individualized huge moments. Very rarely during the course of a regular season do we ask them even to play back-to-back road games in conference play on consecutive weeks. That's incredibly rare in college football. Now, we're asking teams, so all these teams that looked great and we feel like, oh man, we really know what we're going to get from Ohio State and Penn State and Texas or Notre Dame. History would suggest one of these teams is going to go lay a dud in this next round. I'm just telling you right now, one of these teams is going to go out there and not play their best in this next round.
Totally agree. I think when you looked at the spreads, and I noticed this with the conference championship games, I went, wow, like everything's a field goal here. Okay. And then when the first round of the playoffs came out, it's like they want you to take some of these dogs because it's 7.5, it's 8.5 across the board, which again speaks to the matchups and the seeding that maybe if we have time, we'll dig into. I feel like both of us have done so much on it. I just want to make sure we previewed some of the games. But I also think like when you look at some of the stats, like Arizona State's 30th defensively opponents' yards per play. And you can dig into some of the schedule stuff and go, okay, well, who do they play? Like, maybe we'll get to Indiana here. They were third in the country behind Ohio State and Texas. So sometimes it can be a result of your schedule, but it's an interesting comparison there when you go to Boise State and you got to keep scrolling down to 56 with that schedule. So defensively, maybe it speaks back to the mismatch that you think you see on the Boise Penn State side. Okay, Georgia Notre Dame's another one because I think the Stockton quarterback storyline in the SEC title game, it becomes easier to be like, he gave him a real spark when there was a couple decent possessions, but he also threw the disastrous pick. I know the run was huge, but they were clearly afraid to let that guy throw the football.
Yes.
And for good reason.
Yes.
So the way this game is talked about as if he's this massive positive because of the dual threatness of it, I don't know if it's the dual threat thing as much as I just think people are being incredibly convenient the way they're talking about Stockton's impact in this matchup.
Yeah, he's getting a Georgia bump. He's getting a Kirby Smart bump, right? If this was Stockton playing for Arizona State we would all just it would be a total throwaway. And we'd be like, well, that's not going to happen. Yeah, exactly. And so And listen, maybe that's correct because Georgia has earned that and Kirby has earned that. But the difference is that the supporting cast around Stockton has been really bad. And I know that's everyone's like, man, you just hate Georgia. No. They led the country in drops. There's a reason Carson Beck had a poor season. They led the country in drops. If you watch some of their games and the game that they struggled offensively against Georgia Tech or some of these other games, their skill position players don't give Beck any help whatsoever. And now you're going to tell me that a quarterback is going to go in there and make his first start and all of a sudden they're going to be better offensively? That's not a thing. That's not a thing. That is hoping for hope's sake. That is believing in the logo and not actually evaluating what's going to go on. If Georgia wants to win this game, it has to be a low-scoring affair. Notre Dame's defense is one of the better defenses in the country. They're fast. They're athletic. They're physical. Georgia's not going to run up and down the field on them. This is not an offense that goes crazy and goes berserk. I don't think that they're going to be able to just sit there and run the football with their dual-threat quarterback. That's also not a thing. So the pressure is going to be on their defense to stop Notre Dame. And I personally believe that Riley Leonard is a better version of Haynes King. This Georgia team struggles against mobile guys who are willing to run and can be a threat in the run game on the outside. We saw that with Haynes King. We saw that with Jalen Milroe. This matchup, to me, very much favors Notre Dame. And it's not just Stockton. It's everything. If Beck was playing, I would pick Notre Dame. And now Stockton's playing, and I'm like, well, I'm definitely picking Notre Dame in this game.
Yeah, I can see how you get there because the Stockton thing's a complete unknown. I just feel like it's being rounded up because of how that game played out specifically. Maybe you think it's because of the SEC part of it, but I have not liked Beck in so many games. And I thought the Georgia Tech game, it was very telling. Tate Ratledge brings him over to the sideline. He's talking to him because he knows. He's like, you're flat right now or you're not seeing it. He didn't see it against Bama. That game could have been even worse for him. I thought he was actually terrible in the Texas game. He wasn't good in the Texas game.
No, they're only driving the Texas game. They needed a trick play. Other than that, they got the ball at the 35. Every series. Again, you're not going to make a lot of hay in this business picking against Georgia, but this Georgia team is different. This is a totally different team, and I think Notre Dame beats them.
I am worried about Georgia's receivers getting separation against these corners for Notre Dame. because every time like we get the nice replay because we're watching the TV broadcast, I just feel like there's so many times where I just love the way the defensive backs for Notre Dame compete. And
they're good players, man.
This is not the most challenging group of all these guys. Okay, so I want to do some bigger picture stuff because I'm glad we got through all the games. You're right. Like Georgia is not the standard of what Georgia is, right? But they also played an absurd schedule, and I think that to get through that with 2 games would have been fine. If this were the BCS and it's the Joel Klatt talk show, which 2 teams would you want playing for a national championship?
Oregon and Ohio State.
So you would look at the resumes of Georgia and Ohio State.
Well, I just think if this is the BCS, and I'm just saying, like, who do I
it's
think
before
are the
the
best
first
2
round.
teams?
Can we do it before the first round, before the Tennessee game?
So the 2 teams that would have earned their way into a BCS game we would have had an Oregon-Georgia BCS national championship game. That's kind of what it would have been, and I wouldn't have liked it. I would have looked at teams like Texas and Ohio State and Penn State and just wondered in the back of my mind and thought to myself, boy, like what could have been with those teams, which is why I'm actually a huge proponent of this 12-team playoff. I was hyper frustrated with the commentary surrounding the playoff in the first round. Hyper frustrated.
Okay, tell me what specifically made you so mad.
Well,
because I know I said some of it, so we'll talk it out.
This idea that the results on the field were an indictment of the losing team, and that somehow meant that they didn't deserve to be there. I thought that was ridiculous. And in so many ways, what we fail to realize is that in our dreams of perfection in a college football postseason, we don't see the imperfections in all the things that we love around it. The imperfections of the NCAA basketball tournament, the imperfections of the NFL playoffs. I did this stat on my show. Last year's wild card round of the NFL playoffs, the average margin of victory was 17.5. There was one possession game in the 6 games in the wild card round, 1. And yet I didn't hear anybody start laying blanket statements on what teams should have or shouldn't have been there. Now, granted, I understand that there's an automatic qualifying path. And so because of that, you can't say, who deserves. And there's a subjective nature to our sport in college football, which is why we love it. There's certainly that. But this idea that we were going to tear teams down for what they have done and tell them in retrospect that they didn't deserve to be on the field, I just vehemently disagreed with that stance.
We agree, actually, on that. We are aligned. I don't think it's fair to just watch the one game and then write everybody off as if there was 4 magical teams. For the record, if you didn't hear it, at the end of the year, I was not banging the table for Alabama. I was kind of over them, even though at one point I think I bumped them back up. Old Miss, the head-to-head of South Carolina makes it tough for me to make the South Carolina argument. I think I like South Carolina, and I think a committee could have argued them in if you wanted to get, because I think that's if we have a committee, right? If we have a group of people, they're supposed to be able to talk all this stuff out. And it felt very records-based, just as if it were standings. And you're right about the NFL part of it, but the NFL playoff structure is never going to be criticized the same way because it's not based on opinion.
That's right. It's an automatic path.
Yeah. Right. So whenever you factor in a human element to it, there's nothing in our society where people are like, oh, those 10 people decided on that. Nailed it.
Nailed it. No, you're right.
They did.
You're exactly right. And wouldn't you agree that the structure was more flawed than the teams they gave us? And I think that the frustration with the structure of how teams are seeded and who got buys and who's playing and where, I think is definitely more of something I'm willing to have a conversation about. Like what's the structure of how we're doing this? But if you're arguing between like a 3-loss Bama or Ole Miss or South Carolina and an Indiana or SMU, like you kind of lose me because none of those teams I can sit there and pound the table and say they definitely deserve it over that team. They are all flawed at that point. They're all flawed. So what, we're going to let Alabama go and get their brains beat in like they did against Oklahoma on the, so it's like Kentucky won one Power 5 game. It was against Ole Miss, at Ole Miss, and we're just going to like look away. The other rhetoric that I got frustrated, and I hesitate to go down this route just because you get labeled so much, but it did seem so heavily weighted towards the SEC. Like these people are like, oh, the SEC, this and that. And it's like, well, they were awfully quiet after Tennessee got run out of the building on that Saturday night. They were awfully quiet. And I was really frustrated. I thought that was a time to celebrate what was an incredible weekend of college football. We had waited for this. I thought that the expansion of the playoff made the regular season so much better. And the expansion of the teams that were like in it and fan bases that were engaged, like our sport has never been better. With all the problems we have, it's never been better. And we're going to sit there. Oh,
Look, what
again,
happened
like
was
I'm at a loss.
we have 1 year of this, so we don't know what it's going to be like. Give me 10 years of it, and then maybe we'll start to see how it leans. I think the committee loved the Big Ten this year. I'm not normally I would be banging the table for an SEC team, but it was hard for me to do that after the disastrous Saturday night where you have even A&M losing to Auburn in there too, on top of Ole Miss, Florida, and then the Alabama-Oklahoma game. It's a guess. I think Alabama would have been better against Notre Dame than Indiana was. But again, it's a guess. And with the 3 losses, like I'm not going to win that argument.
Not if Milrose throwing the picks like he did against OU.
Hey,
and by the way, Indiana's going to play that game a lot differently if Rourke just makes a better throw in the first series. You know what I mean? Like these games, they go either way.
Yeah, I think my problem with Indiana is that, it's 2 things. They didn't beat anyone, and I don't think you should be able to play for a national championship when you beat no one.
That is that is totally out of their control, though. Think about this. They're on their schedule. If you and I did this show in August and we said, hey, who's got a tough schedule in the Big Ten? We would have said Indiana because they had to play at Ohio State, they had to play Michigan, and they had to play Washington. Those 2 teams just played for a national championship. So like it didn't play out that way. If anything, again, this is shining a light on the flaw in these super conference structures in terms of conference schedules, because there's no way you can know, even in August, who's going to be playing the great schedule and who's going to be playing the easy schedule.
I would push back on that because in August, Washington returned 1 guy out of the entire 22 starters, and the coach was gone, and the NFL first round QB, and the 3 NFL receivers. So I was going to be surprised if Washington was really competitive. I also didn't love Michigan this August, and I know other people did. I got that one right. I get plenty of stuff wrong. You have a coaching change. Your NFL quarterback is gone, and they went to 3 different quarterbacks this year, and they couldn't throw a pass. So when I looked at the schedule, and you're right, it's not necessarily their fault, and maybe it was Signetti with me a little bit. Like I watched your YouTube page, which I would encourage everybody to check out. It does great. When Signetti came on with you guys in the podcast to talk about like the out of conference, and he took the swipe at Alabama for playing Mercer, which everybody who hates the SEC loves pointing out at the end of the year, conveniently forgetting the out of conference games that they'll play against other Power 4 programs. Like, I just think it's a tough look for Signetti when you play Western Illinois, Charlotte, and Florida International, and they're not going to play it. So, and then Signetti went on game day. I've already covered it. And like, I get what he has to do. He's in Bloomington. It's one of the worst histories in the history of college football. And much like Lane Kiffin and much like other coaches that were like, hey, pay attention to me. I need the attention. It's good because you're talking about us. It has nothing to do with the Hoosiers specifically. It will be a fundamental belief I will always have that if you get a chance to play for a national championship, I'd like to see you beat one team. And in the 2 teams that played that were good, they got destroyed. And this is the problem, though, is that all those Indiana fans had to hear it from the 3 SEC fan bases. And then 24 hours later, it came back to bite all the SEC fans in the ass. So essentially,
they had to hear it during the game on the broadcast.
Yeah, exactly. Well, all right.
Come on.
So you didn't like that from McDonough and McElroy?
Is what it is.
You know what? I don't want you to think I was being unfair. I guess the way I asked that, it seemed like I was going to put you in a spot to criticize colleagues, which you obviously didn't really like during it. Okay, let's do this. Do you think the SEC is? No, I'm just kidding. Do you think it's held to an impossible standard, actually, and people are unfair about it?
I wish that in all of college football, to minimize the impact of these conference schedules that are going to be imbalanced. I wish we could get to a place where we were all playing more conference games. Every conference. I think that everyone should play 10 conference games. And that's the only way to really know, like who are the best teams in your conference? What are the seedings? And if we do that, I do believe that in the future, we are going to get to a place where we have a model that's not resembling more of what the NFL is, but in the instance of defining paths to the playoffs, I don't think it's going to be as subjective in the future as what it was this year. I do believe that we're going to have a bit of a tweak to the structure, maybe by 26. I think they're going to add 2 teams. I think we're going to go to 14. I think leagues are going to play more games, and that we're going to have more automatic bids. And I think that the SEC, rightly so, and the Big Ten, rightly so, will get the bulk of those automatic bids. And there will be more automatic bids also for the Big 12 and the ACC. And because of that, I think that defined path is going to put a lot of this to bed.
Well, it's never going to put it to bed because, we're going to have arguments from teams 15, 16, and 17. And then if it's a conference thing and it becomes very political, it was just an incredible cycle of hate directed in all directions at 20. And then everybody got it. Like no one was absolved from any of it. Here's what and look, you know this better than I do because I think you're talking to the power brokers far more than I am. But it felt like this system was the compromise to get everybody even again after like what seemed absurd thinking back to going to a 14 playoffs. It's like, how did everyone agree to this knowing at least one conference was going to get hosed? And in the years where the SEC had 2, it's like, so what did we agree to here? So this was about being as egalitarian as possible. And I think they were like, everybody gets in and then we're doing automatic bids and it's going to be great. And you're going to get these buys. And then you have Ohio State, Oregon in a second round matchup. And then you have Boise as a 3 seed. So do you think that will be enough, just the result from this year, to motivate change? Would you want reseeding or something? You know what I mean? I don't know.
Yes. So the first thing is that this was built with a bunch of constraints. And one of the constraints is the bowl system that had to be fit into it.
Right. On top of everything else you're trying to figure out.
Exactly. And then the other constraint is this idea that they were all not going to agree unless they felt like the value of their conference championship game was going to be upheld. Because that's a big deal for all these conferences, because that means a lot of money. They sell that game. That is a moneymaker for these conferences. So the idea that there wouldn't be buys for conference champions was a total non-starter, because all of a sudden you would say like, well, now our game doesn't matter, the conference championship game. And so that's how they landed on that you have to be a champion to have a bye, is to try to retain the value of that championship game. When we go to 14, I think there's going to be 2 buys. I think the SEC and the Big Ten are going to take those, and they're going to tell the other conferences like, hey, figure it out. Tell us how you want to give us your 2 teams. And that's honestly what's going to happen, is that you can only appease everybody for so long before the people with the most power at the table start flexing those muscles. That's what's going to end up happening over the next few years.
Yeah. I don't know. There's just so many things. And look, it happens in the NBA. It happens in the NFL. We spend all of July fixing baseball on talk shows. It's just as soon as we get something that's like, well, okay, this
do you
is
like the golden batter? Do you like this idea?
I would just be afraid, if I were baseball, of trying to make changes that get people that don't watch it to watch it. And I think what happens here, and I said this years ago about baseball, it's like, why, like if you're not watching baseball now, why would a 120 game season make you watch now? Like, if you're not watching, why would less of something motivate you than to watch it? I mean, you can get into the scarcity of the NFL product against all the other leagues, and that's certainly a massive advantage. And, the ability to watch it essentially on one day, even though I think the NFL is going to be on every single night here coming, I don't know how many years it'll be, but I think that's ultimately what the plan is. But whenever there is some structure to something, like, look, this is not new. We hated the original system. We hated the BCS. We hated the 4-team. You're right on the playoff, on the 12 team. We cared about the outcome of games in a way that we never have before. Georgia Tech was a really important football game, and that would not have been. And Georgia, even with that ridiculous schedule, would have been eliminated probably from the sky. Well, look, if they lose that game, they're eliminated from the conversation entirely.
Let me give you another one. Let me give you another one. Colorado at Kansas. Massive playoff implications. And it's just like, that's good for the sport.
What I didn't like is we don't have to talk about Indiana anymore. What I didn't like was Ohio State, Michigan not mattering. And it matters. Look, you're there. It's incredible. And I also think, like, I wish I would have been a local Columbus reporter, because I think that being around that program and how mad they were for 2 weeks was a big part of what we saw against Tennessee. It's like, you guys, like, you have no idea what you're about to face and all the bullshit that we dealt with 2 straight weeks. Which I thought Herb Street and Fowler did a good job in a blowout of filling and telling that story and giving that kind of perspective of, like, they were sharing some stories, being like, this was a pissed off bear here. But what I think, as much as I completely agree about games that we would not have cared, would not have been on the national radar, that part is a massive win. I guess I think back to, like, the LSU Bama games for the division. I think Ohio State and Michigan, and it's like, yeah, but now you can just lose it and it doesn't matter. So I don't know if I love that trade-off, but it's better for eyes and it's better for awareness. It's better for a total number. That trade-off is a win business-wise, even if some of the rivalry stuff, I think, can be diminished because as much will not be on the line.
There's always going to be unintended consequences, sure. Unfortunately, because listen, I'm with you, and I would love to, and I'm incredibly lucky. I think about those 3 games that I called, and like, they were 1 versus 2, 2 versus 3, 2 versus 4, with everything on the line for 3 straight years, and that was incredible. So yes, I get what you're saying, and I don't know if there's a great fix for that. I really don't.
No, because we're not going the other way. So I need to put it to bed. And I think there's a lot of, like, 24, 25 college football segments I need to retire for my own, for my audience's benefit, even if I'm just railing. Look, you know how much I love the work you do and how much I appreciate you on the broadcast. And again, a reminder for everybody here tonight to check out on 7:30 Eastern Time on Fox, DirecTV, Holiday Bowl, Syracuse, and Washington State, and Joel Klatt's podcast as well. Enjoy the rest of the bowl season, man. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And thanks for having me on, man. I love coming on here and chopping it up. This is great.
I even wore my Big Ten sweatshirt with the Oregon symbol on it for you.
Look at you. Look at you.
Fair and balanced.
I tell you what, fair and balanced. That's what I think of when I think of you.
I don't know that any of us think that about the other person, but I like you saying it out loud. That was good.
That's right. That's right. You can turn it into a soundbite there, right?
Thanks, man.
All right, bro.